August 16, 1943. Kiska Island, the Aleutians. Sergeant Don Moore of the 1st Special Service Force kicks open the rough-hewn timber door of the Japanese barracks, his Thompson submachine gun raised and ready to spit .45 caliber death. His heart hammers against his ribs, a frantic rhythm matching the distant, muffled cracks of rifle fire echoing through the dense, suffocating fog outside. He expects a scream, a bayonet lunge, or the terrifying click of a Nambu pistol. Instead, he is met with the smell of stale tobacco and soy sauce. Something is wrong. The air is too still. The silence is heavier than the fog. Moore steps inside, his boots crunching on scattered papers. The room is warm. A pot of coffee sits on a cast-iron stove, the embers beneath it fading but still glowing a dull, angry red. On the table, bowls of rice are half-eaten, chopsticks resting across the rims as if the diners had just stepped out for a smoke. But the dust settling on the floorboards tells a different story. Moore lowers his weapon, his eyes scanning the shadowy corners. There are no bodies, there is no blood. He moves to the wall where a chalkboard hangs. Scribbled in chalk, in distinct, mocking English, is a message that freezes the blood in his veins. We shall come again. Adolf Hitler is seeing a psychiatrist. Outside, a burst of machine gun fire tears through the mist, followed by the agonizing scream of an American soldier. Moore realizes with a sick, sinking feeling that the enemy his brothers are dying fighting isn't in this room. The enemy isn't on the island at all. The 5,000 Japanese defenders they had come to annihilate have vanished into the ether, leaving behind only booby traps, a stray dog, and a vacuum of paranoia that is currently causing the elite commandos of the United States and Canada to slaughter one another in the blindness of the Aleutian fog. This discovery was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of a realization that would haunt the Allied command for decades. The invasion of Kiska was supposed to be the bloody climax of the Aleutian campaign. Instead, it was becoming the deadliest friendly fire incident of the Pacific War, a tragic farce where the most lethal unit in the world was unleashed against a phantom. The journey to this misty, frozen hellscape had begun nearly a year earlier, in the summer of 1942. The concept was born not in a war room in Washington, but in the eccentric mind of Jeffrey Pike, a British scientist and inventor who operated on the fringes of military sanity. Pike envisioned a small, elite force capable of fighting in winter conditions, dropping behind enemy lines in Norway to destroy heavy water plants and hydroelectric infrastructure. He called it Project Plow. To execute this vision, the Allied High Command turned to a man who looked more like an academic than a killer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick. Only 35 years old, Frederick was a staff officer with no combat experience. Yet he was tasked with forging the hardest men from two nations into a single, razor-sharp weapon. The unit was officially designated the 1st Special Service Force. They established their base at Fort William Henry in Helena, Montana. The recruitment posters were stark, calling for lumberjacks, forest rangers, hunters, and prospectors, men who could survive in the wild and kill without hesitation. The ranks were filled with a chaotic mix of American misfits and Canadian toughs. They were trained to a standard that broke weaker men. They marched 60 miles in sub-zero temperatures. They became experts in demolition, rock climbing, and amphibious landings. They mastered the use of every weapon in the Allied and Axis arsenals, from the Browning automatic rifle to the German MG-42. But their signature weapon was the V-42 Stiletto, a double-edged fighting knife with a skull-crushing pommel designed specifically for the force to sever arteries in silence. By the summer of 1943, the Devil's Brigade, as they would come to be known, was ready. But their target was not Norway. It was the Aleutian Islands, a volcanic chain stretching from Alaska toward Siberia. The Japanese had seized the islands of Attu and Kiska in June 1942, the only American soil occupied by a foreign power during the war. In May 1943, the U.S. 7th Infantry Division had retaken Attu in a horrific battle. The 2,300 Japanese defenders, adhering to the Code of Bushido, refused to surrender. They launched a final suicidal banzai charge that resulted in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Only 28 Japanese survived. The battle for Attu cost the Americans 549 killed and 1,148 wounded. Kiska was next. Intelligence reports were terrifying. The island was a fortress, defended by the 5,183rd Infantry Detachment and elements of the Maizuru 3rd Special Naval Landing Force. Over 5,000 seasoned troops commanded by Rear Admiral Manzo Akiyama. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed a honeycomb of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. The garrison was dug in deep, waiting to die for the Emperor. The Allied plan, Operation Cottage, called for an overwhelming force of 34,426 soldiers, including 5,300 Canadians and the elite 1st Special Service Force. The FSF was the spearhead. Their mission was to land before the main force, scale the jagged cliffs that the Japanese deemed impassable, and flank the enemy positions. They were the blade aimed at the throat of the Kiska garrison. On August 13, 1943, the invasion fleet departed Adak. The men of the force sharpened their V-42s and blackened their faces. They expected a slaughter worse than Attu. They expected to fight for every inch of volcanic rock. As the landing craft bobbed in the freezing Bering Sea on the morning of August 15th, the adrenaline was toxic. The expectation of a bloodbath was not paranoia. It was based on a clear, established pattern of Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific. From Guadalcanal to Buna, and most recently at Attu, the Imperial Japanese Army had demonstrated a terrifying consistency. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They dug spider holes and tunnels, turning the very earth into a weapon. At Attu, the Japanese had utilized the reverse slope defense, waiting until American troops crested the hills before opening fire from concealed positions. They used the fog to launch infiltration attacks, slipping into American foxholes with bayonets and grenades. Allied intelligence assumed Kiska would be Attu amplified. The geographic scope of Kiska was larger, the mountains steeper, and the garrison significantly larger than the force on Attu. Throughout July 1943, the 11th Air Force pounded Kiska. B-24 Liberators and B-25 Mitchells flew sortie after sortie, dropping 424 tons of bombs on the island. The pilots reported heavy anti-aircraft fire. Navy destroyers and battleships, including the USS Idaho and USS Tennessee, shelled the harbor and the main camp, turning the volcanic landscape into a cratered moonscape. The pilots and naval gunners reported results that confirmed the enemy's presence. They saw muzzle flashes. They saw new earthworks appearing overnight. They saw radio traffic spiking. Every indicator shouted that Admiral Akiyama was hunkering down, preparing a killing zone on the beaches. The Allied planners, led by Major General Holland Howling Mad Smith, calculated the butcher's bill. Based on the Attu ratios, they estimated that taking Kiska would cost as many as 7,000 Allied casualties. They prepared field hospitals and stockpiled blood plasma. This pattern of fanatical resistance was the psychological bedrock of the invasion force. The men of the Devil's Brigade were not just trained to fight. They were conditioned to expect an enemy who would strap explosives to his body and dive under a tank. This mindset created a hair-trigger tension. When you expect a ghost to jump out of the fog with a knife, every shifting shadow looks like a killer. But the pattern depended entirely on one assumption, that the Japanese adhered to a rigid code that forbade withdrawal. Allied intelligence failed to account for the cunning of the Japanese Navy. While the Army preached death before dishonor, the Navy was pragmatic. They needed those 5,000 men to defend the Kuril Islands. As the Allied fleet steamed toward Kiska, the men cleaned their rifles and wrote their last letters home, convinced they were sailing into a meat grinder. They did not know that the flak reported by pilots was often just exploding gas drums or wishful thinking. They did not know that the radio traffic was silence. The pattern was a lie. But by late July 1943, the tactical picture had secretly shifted in a way the Allies could not comprehend. The turning point was not a battle, but a disappearance. It was known to the Japanese as Operation Cottage. Under the cover of the notorious Aleutian fog, a thick, soup-like mist that could linger for weeks, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura led a task force of 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers toward Kiska. It was a suicide run through American naval blockades. On July 28th, utilizing the heavy overcast that grounded American reconnaissance planes, Kimura slipped his ships into Kiska Harbor. In a feat of logistical brilliance that rivals the evacuation of Dunkirk, the Japanese garrison destroyed their codes, disabled their heavy guns, and booby-trapped their quarters. In just 55 minutes, 5,183 men boarded the ships. They left nothing of value except 70,000 gallons of fuel and a few stray dogs. By the time the fog lifted slightly the next day, the Japanese fleet was gone, slipping away like phantoms into the northern Pacific. The Allies, blinded by the very weather they cursed, saw none of this. On August 2nd, Allied pilots reported spotting trucks moving near the harbor. On August 12th, a naval bombardment drew no return fire. But planners dismissed this as fire discipline, the Japanese refusing to give away their positions. On August 15th, at 6:30 hours, the first wave of the 1st Special Service Force hit the beach at a cove designated Pine. The water was freezing, the sand black and volcanic. The men rushed the beach, weapons leveled, screaming battle cries to intimidate the defenders. Silence. The only sound was the wind howling through the sedge-grass and the crash of the surf. Colonel Frederick pushed his men forward, up the steep ridges, expecting an ambush at every turn. The fog descended, reducing visibility to less than 15 feet. It was like looking through a glass of milk, recalled Private First Class Bill Story. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, let alone a Jap bunker. As night fell on August 15th, the turning point curdled into a nightmare. The Forcemen, high on benzodrine and adrenaline, dug in on the ridgelines. The cold was bone-deep. Hallucinations set in. At 2200 hours, a shot rang out, then a burst of BAR fire, then the heavy thump of grenades. "They're here," someone screamed. "They're charging the line." For the next 48 hours, the island erupted in sporadic, terrifying firefights. Platoons of the FSF engaged what they thought were Japanese patrols flanking them in the mist. Tracers cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but wet rock. Men claimed they saw shapes, helmets, bayonets. They fired until their barrels glowed red. On the lower slopes, troops from the U.S. 7th Division, mistaking the Canadian FSF detachments for enemy troops due to their different uniforms and equipment, opened fire. The Canadians, thinking they were being ambushed by the Japanese rearguard, returned fire with their Johnson LMGs.
In one tragic incident, an American patrol spotted a figure moving near a cave entrance. They unleashed a hail of grenades and rifle fire. When they advanced to check the body, they found a soldier from their own regiment riddled with American bullets. The revelation came slowly, agonizingly. On August 17th, patrols finally reached the main Japanese harbor camp. They found the scene Sergeant Moore discovered: the empty barracks, the cold stoves, the mocking messages. They found 4 Scarecrow anti-aircraft guns fashioned from stovepipes and wood, painted to look like heavy artillery from the air. The shock was absolute. Brigadier General Ralph C. Smith, commanding the ground forces, refused to believe it. He ordered a continued search, convinced the Japanese had retreated to underground caverns. The search continued for days, resulting in more friendly fire incidents. The turning point was a cruel joke. The invasion force had successfully landed, maneuvered, and engaged in combat operations for 3 days.
The catastrophe at Kiska was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of interpretation, born from a design philosophy that prioritized aggression over observation. The 1st Special Service Force had been designed, engineered really, to be the tip of the spear. Colonel Frederick and the Allied command had forged a unit that was a hammer, and to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The specifications for the FSSF required men who were aggressive, athletic, and willing to close with the enemy. Their training emphasized the kill zone, the immediate space around a soldier where hesitation meant death. The V-42 Stiletto was the physical embodiment of this philosophy. It was not a utility knife. It was a delicate, precision killing instrument with a thumb rest on the ricasso to allow for a thrust that could penetrate a helmet or a sternum. It was designed for an enemy that was tangible, present, and lethal. However, the Japanese design philosophy for Operation Kago was diametrically opposed. It was based on toni, escape, and evasion. Admiral Kimura realized that the honorable death of 5,000 men on Kiska served no strategic purpose. The mathematics were brutally simple. Japan was running out of trained soldiers. The evacuation was a masterpiece of deception, designed to exploit the Americans' own aggressive momentum against them. The Japanese engineers left behind a different kind of weapon, one that required no soldiers to operate. They turned the island into a passive-aggressive killing machine. Booby traps were sewn with meticulous care. The Japanese left behind innocuous-looking objects: a discarded rifle, a helmet lying in the grass, a crate of supplies. But beneath them, they buried Type 93 landmines and improvised explosives connected by tripwires so thin they were invisible in the fog. One particularly insidious design involved the rat trap. The Japanese wired explosives to door handles and floorboards in the barracks. They rigged phonographs to detonate when the needle was dropped. They understood the curiosity of the victor. They knew the Americans would want souvenirs. This created a fatal mismatch. The Allied soldiers were designed to react to movement and fire. The Japanese defense was designed to react to touch and presence. The most devastating element of the Ghost defense was the exploitation of the environment. The Japanese knew the fog. They knew how it distorted sound. A shout from 10 yards away could sound like it was coming from a mile away, or vice versa. They knew that damp, freezing air lowered morale and heightened paranoia. By leaving the island empty, they allowed the environment to amplify the FSSF's aggression back onto itself. The decision to evacuate rather than fight was a strategic anomaly for the Japanese, but it exposed the flaw in the Allied total destruction doctrine. You cannot destroy what is not there.
The consequences of the Ghost invasion were immediate, bloody, and humiliating. While the Japanese suffered 0 casualties during the actual invasion phase, the Allies bled profusely. The mathematics of attrition on Kiska defy the logic of warfare. The total Allied casualty count for Operation Cottage was 313 men. Of these, nearly 100 were killed in action, KIA, or died of wounds. Friendly fire accounted for the vast majority of the gunshot wounds. In the dense fog of the first 2 days, 24 Americans and 4 Canadians were killed by their own side. Dozens more were wounded. One tragic firefight on August 16th involved 2 American platoons flanking a ridge from opposite sides. They engaged each other for 30 minutes, screaming for medics, convinced they were pinning down a Japanese rearguard. But the deadliest killer was not the rifle. It was the leftover malice of the Japanese engineers. On August 17th and 18, as troops began to secure the empty island, the booby traps began to detonate. A soldier kicking a crate triggered a blast that took his legs. A squad entering a bunker triggered a collapse that buried them alive. The naval component of the operation suffered the most catastrophic loss. On August 18th, the destroyer USS Abner Reed was patrolling off Kiska Harbor. At 1:50, a massive explosion rocked the ship. She had struck a Japanese mine, left behind as a parting gift by Admiral Kimura's fleet. The stern of the destroyer was blown completely off. The ship did not sink, but the cost was horrific. 71 sailors were killed and 47 were wounded. The ocean burned for hours, the oil slick claiming men who had survived the initial blast. Even the Air Force was not spared. During the buildup and the invasion, several aircraft were lost to the perilous weather, slamming into the volcanic peaks hidden by the clouds. The psychological consequences were harder to quantify, but equally devastating. The Devil's Brigade, these hand-picked super soldiers, felt cheated and foolish. They had keyed themselves up for the fight of their lives, only to be involved in a deadly pantomime. The morale plummeted. Men who had killed their friends in the fog were inconsolable. "We felt like fools," wrote Sergeant Robert Burhans in his memoirs. "We were the best trained killers in the Army, and we spent 3 days shooting at shadows and blowing ourselves up." There was also a bizarre dark humor that emerged from the trauma. The soldiers found Explosion, a small dog left behind by the Japanese. The dog became an instant celebrity, the only prisoner of war captured on Kiska. The troops cared for him, perhaps trying to find some humanity in the absurdity of the situation. In the press, the operation was initially reported as a great victory, the reclamation of American soil. But as the truth leaked out, that the enemy had slipped the noose, it became a political embarrassment. It was dubbed the greatest training exercise in history. But for the families of the men on the Abner Reed or the soldiers shot by their own brothers in the fog, it was no exercise. It was a waste. When the fog finally lifted and the guns fell silent, the final accounting of Operation Cottage revealed a stark and bitter ledger. The invasion force had deployed over 34,000 troops, 95 ships, and 168 aircraft. They had expended roughly 400,000 pounds of explosives in the pre-invasion bombardment. The Japanese had deployed 0 troops to meet them. The result was 92 Allied dead and 221 wounded. Japanese casualties, 0 killed, 0 wounded, aside from the dogs. The production statistics of the operation reveal the immense cost of logistics. Millions of dollars in fuel, ammunition, and supplies were burned up to retake a rock that was already empty. Comparative analysis with the Battle of Attu suggests that had the Japanese stayed, the Allies would have likely suffered over 3,000 casualties to root them out. In that sense, the Ghost invasion was a strategic victory. The island was retaken with far fewer lives lost than a pitched battle would have claimed. But the philosophical difference was glaring. The American approach was heavy, industrial, and reliant on overwhelming firepower. The Japanese approach in this instance was fluid and deceptive. The V-42 Stiletto, the icon of the FSSF, saw no enemy blood on Kiska. Its first combat test was a failure, not of the weapon, but of the opportunity to use it. The knives remained in their leather sheaths, or worse, were used to open rations in the empty Japanese mess halls. The survivors of Kiska carried a unique burden. They were combat veterans who had never seen the enemy. They had survived the phantom battle, and the experience forged a cynical, hardened edge in the 1st Special Service Force.
August 20, 1943. The fog recedes, revealing the stark volcanic beauty of Kiska. Colonel Robert Frederick stands near the captured Japanese headquarters. In his hand, he holds a Japanese teacup, delicate and painted with cherry blossoms, a fragile remnant of the ghosts who had occupied this place. He looks out over the bay where the Abner Reed is being towed away, a smoking ruin. The Ghost invasion of Kiska was the surreal baptism of the legendary Devil's Brigade. They arrived as elite killers and left as veterans of a battle against their own shadows. This bizarre and tragic operation, often a footnote in the grand histories of the war, taught them a lesson no training ground ever could: that the most dangerous enemy is not always the one in the opposing trench, but the fear and uncertainty within. For the FSF, Kiska was a crucible of psychological horror that would paradoxically steel them for the very real and brutal fights that awaited them. When they eventually reached the mountains of Italy to storm Monte la Defensa and later the beachhead at Anzio, they would fight with a terrifying ferocity. They would earn their nickname, the Black Devils, from the Germans. But that ferocity was born in the embarrassment and tragedy of the Aleutians. The examination of the empty island provided the final proof. The enemy was not just a force to be outgunned, they were a force to be outthought. And as Frederick crushed the delicate teacup in his gloved hand, he knew the easy part was over.